My name is Isabella Grant. I am 28 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. I was the obedient daughter, the one who followed every expectation, who smiled through Thanksgiving dinners and nodded politely when my parents boasted about my place in the family. But I was about to learn that all the trust I had, all the loyalty I felt, had been built on a lie. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever felt like the black sheep in your own family. Trust me, you want to see what happened next. It was Thanksgiving morning when they told me. I had just arrived at the family home, the familiar smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filling the air, thinking it would be just another ordinary holiday. My parents had been unusually tense, whispering to each other, casting quick glances my way. I smiled nervously, brushing off the feeling that something was wrong. But when my father looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Isabella, you're on your own, go live in the streets, you don't belong here anymore," I froze. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to scream, I wanted to tell them they were out of their minds. But the words had a weight to them, a cruel finality. My own parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, were turning me away on Thanksgiving, a day meant for family, for love, for gratitude. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to believe that the people who had raised me, who had watched me grow, could treat me this way. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mother, who had always been the softer one, didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at me with something I had never seen before, a cold, calculating detachment that made my stomach churn. "Yes, Isabella," she said calmly, "it's time you learned what life really is. You can't stay here anymore. Pack your things and leave now." I left. I walked out of that house carrying only a small bag of essentials, my mind spinning. The streets felt different that day, harsher somehow, though I had walked these sidewalks countless times before. I tried to ignore the sting of betrayal, tried to remind myself that I was strong, that I had survived challenges before. But nothing had prepared me for this being exiled by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. For the first few hours I wandered aimlessly. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where to go. I felt the eyes of strangers on me, the subtle judgments that made me shrink into myself. My pride burned, my anger bubbled, and yet there was a quiet, simmering determination forming inside me. I would not let them break me. I would not let them think they had won. What they didn't know, what not a single one of them suspected, was that I had a life, a separate world hidden from their eyes. I had spent years building something they would never understand. My investments, my side ventures, my quiet accumulation of wealth, they were mine alone. They had thought I was naive, that I was weak. But in reality, I controlled more than they ever could imagine. I didn't just survive, I thrived. And that day, as I walked the streets they had cast me into, I made a silent vow. They were going to regret underestimating me. I found a small corner near a diner and sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. My stomach was empty, my hands shook from the sudden chill, but my mind was sharper than ever. I thought about every word my parents had said, every dismissive glance, every whispered insult I had endured growing up. The memories stung, but they fueled me. I realized that their cruelty was not just about punishment, it was about control. They wanted to see me humbled, broken, begging to come back. But I would give them something far worse. I would rise above them, and when I did, they would have nowhere to hide from the truth. As night fell, the streets transformed into a different world. Shadows stretched long, the air smelled of exhaust and distant food carts, and the sounds of the city felt louder, sharper. I wandered through the alleyways, pretending to be lost, pretending to be vulnerable, all the while calculating. This wasn't just survival. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that would turn the tables on everyone who had doubted me. I watched the people around me, the faces hardened by their own struggles. And I realized something crucial. The streets could teach lessons that no classroom, no home, no sheltered upbringing ever could. They could show you fear, yes, but they could also reveal strength, cunning, and resourcefulness. And I would learn quickly I had to, because I wasn't just surviving for myself. I was surviving for the day I would make them pay. The first night was the hardest. Hunger gnawed at my insides, exhaustion weighed down my limbs, and every noise made me jump. I found a bench tucked away from the main street lights and curled into myself. trying to remember that this was temporary. I had a plan, I had resources, but they had no idea what lay ahead. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to sleep, imagining the moment I would walk back into their lives, not as the daughter they rejected, but as someone untouchable, unstoppable, someone who had all the power they thought they had taken away. By the second day, I had started observing the rhythms of the streets. I noticed where people came for food, where small businesses left donations, where those less fortunate found warmth. I blended in, wore layers to hide the expensive clothes underneath, and kept my head down. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been thrown out to appear powerless, yet in truth, I had the means to live in comfort without ever returning to their home. I could have called a private car, booked a suite, lived in luxury. But that wasn't the lesson they needed. That wasn't the revenge that would feel sweet enough. I met people who looked at me with suspicion, who whispered and stared, who offered me a place for a few hours in exchange for stories. I told them half-truths, weaving a tale of misfortune that concealed my real story. Every interaction, every glance, every smirk from someone who assumed they knew my place in the world added fuel to the fire inside me. By the end of that first week, I had a strategy forming, not just to survive, but to reclaim what they had tried to take, and to show them the full extent of their mistake. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The people who had promised love, guidance, protection, they had abandoned me on the one day meant to remind families of gratitude. Their disregard was painful, almost unbearable. But as I lay on the cold pavement, staring at the stars hidden behind the city lights, I realized something important. Pain can be transformed into power. Anger can be transformed into strategy. Betrayal can be transformed into triumph. I smiled to myself quietly, almost silently, as the city hummed around me. They had thought they were sending me away, thought they were stripping me of dignity, thought they were teaching me a lesson. But they had underestimated one crucial thing. I was not just a daughter. I was Isabella Grant, and they had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. The journey had only just begun. The days on the streets were colder than I expected. Not just because of the winter chill that crept through my thin layers, but because of the isolation, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a heavy coat I couldn't shrug off. I watched families gather through cafe windows, couples laugh while holding hands, and I felt a strange mixture of longing and fury. My parents had made a grave mistake, and every sight of warmth and happiness outside reminded me of it. I learned quickly that survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about reading people, learning their patterns, understanding who could be trusted, and more importantly, who underestimated you. I kept my expensive watch hidden beneath a sleeve, my designer shoes worn down to look ordinary, my hair tied back to hide the shine. Every detail mattered. If they thought I was just another homeless girl wandering the streets, I could play that role to perfection. And I would. Food was the first challenge. Most places wouldn't let you in without spending money. I started observing delivery routines, the back doors of restaurants, the charity bins near stores. I didn't steal, not in the way people think, because my life wasn't about desperation. It was about strategy. I found small ways to appear vulnerable while remaining untouchable, borrowing a little here, asking politely there, learning who controlled what on these streets. Every interaction was a test, every small kindness or glance a tool I could use later. By the end of the first week, I had a routine. Morning, I'd scout areas for discarded but untouched food. Afternoon, I'd move through more populated streets, watching interactions, learning names, faces, weaknesses. Evening, I'd find a secluded spot, write down notes in a small notebook I had smuggled with me, jotting down observations, ideas, potential allies. I wasn't just surviving, I was mapping the environment, treating every corner, every alley as a chessboard, and then the first unexpected encounter happened. I was sitting near a small park, shivering under the hood of my coat when a young woman approached me. She looked like she had been living on the streets for months, maybe years, with a toughness in her eyes that spoke of survival. "You don't belong here," she said bluntly, sitting beside me without waiting for an invitation. I looked at her slightly amused. Neither do you, I suppose. I replied, keeping my voice neutral, calm. I didn't want to reveal too much. The streets had taught me quickly, reveal weakness and people will exploit it. She laughed, a sharp, dry sound. Maybe not, but I've learned to make it work. You'll either sink or swim. Your choice. Her words struck a chord. I realized that part of this forced exile wasn't just physical survival, it was mental. I had to adapt, to learn, to sharpen myself in ways I never imagined. And as much as I hated to admit it, she could be useful, not as a friend, not yet, but as a guide, a source of insight into this world my parents had assumed I couldn't navigate. I spent the next few days following her discreetly, watching how she moved, how she negotiated with shopkeepers, how she found warmth without asking too much. She had an instinct I could respect, a skill I could learn from. But more importantly, she had access and knowledge and information. In the streets, knowledge was power, and I had plans to wield it in ways my parents couldn't even imagine. Meanwhile, my parents went about their Thanksgiving as though nothing had happened. The images they posted on social media, smiling, laughing, pretending to be the perfect family, cut me deeper than their words had. Every post, every story, was a reminder that they were oblivious to the storm they had created, to the daughter they had thrown out without a second thought. They had underestimated me completely. By the end of the second week, I had begun small experiments in influence. I learned which street vendors could be persuaded, which regular passers-by could be subtly manipulated to give me advantages. I tested my patience, my resilience, and my ability to observe without being seen. Every day, I reminded myself that this exile was temporary, that my real life, my real power, was waiting just below the surface. It was during one of these experiments that I first tasted a small, bittersweet victory. A local cafe owner, a kind man in his 50s, was known for giving leftover pastries to the homeless. I approached him cautiously, weaving a story of misfortune, keeping my tone humble. By the third day, I had earned not just pastries but his trust. He didn't know who I really was, but in a subtle way, he began treating me with a respect that surprised even me. And that's when it hit me. If I could win small victories here, quietly, invisibly, I could turn every interaction into a stepping stone toward the day I revealed my full power. But survival wasn't without its threats. Other people on the streets were not as kind or cautious as I was. I had to learn quickly how to avoid confrontation, how to read aggression before it happened, how to disappear into a crowd without drawing attention. The city was full of eyes, full of judgment, and full of danger. Yet, paradoxically, it was also full of lessons, and I learned faster than anyone could imagine. By the third week, the streets no longer felt like a cage. They felt like a proving ground. I had learned to move with purpose, to project vulnerability while hiding strength, to observe without being noticed, to gather information from casual conversations and fleeting glances. I had become something my parents would never have expected. A woman who could survive anywhere, thrive anywhere, and plan her revenge silently, meticulously. And the thought of that revenge, once distant, now consumed me. I didn't want them to merely regret their actions. I wanted them to be shocked, left speechless, forced to confront the truth of who I really was. I wanted the humiliation of discovery to cut them deeper than any words could. Every night, as I curled up under blankets I had scavenged or earned, I imagined the moment I would walk back into their lives, not as a supplicant, not as a powerless daughter, but as Isabella Grant, the woman who had everything, the woman who had survived their cruelty and transformed it into unstoppable power. And I knew, deep down, that the streets had taught me exactly what I needed to know: patience, observation, and the quiet, undeniable power of strategy. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had won. But in truth, they had only set the stage for their own undoing, and I intended to make the next act unforgettable. By the third week on the streets, I had learned more than I could have imagined, not just about survival, but about people, about how quickly they judged, how easily they underestimated, and how much influence could be gained by appearing powerless. And that's when it hit me. This was no longer just survival. This was my opportunity. My parents thought they had cast me out. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but they didn't know that while I had been homeless, I had been quietly preparing, observing, plotting. I started small. I tested my influence, reaching out to people who could unknowingly assist me. A barista who always slipped me an extra sandwich. A street performer who shared gossip from the city blocks he traveled. Each interaction, I collected information, quietly mapping connections that would later serve me. It felt almost like a game, an elaborate chessboard where every pawn, every knight, every overlooked piece could become instrumental in my plan. And then the first chance to strike in earnest came. I had learned that my parents were hosting a post-Thanksgiving fundraiser, a lavish event they prided themselves on, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and their social circle. Normally, I would have ignored it. Who cared about their superficial parties? But this time, I felt a surge of satisfaction at the idea that I could quietly disrupt the image they so carefully curated. I didn't have to attend the event personally. I had the means to influence it without revealing my identity. I started with small interventions, anonymous tips to vendors about overbooking, subtle financial adjustments in one of their minor business ventures that would create slight yet embarrassing disruptions. Each move was deliberate, careful, invisible. By the end of the week, I watched from a distance as minor chaos unfolded, leaving my parents flustered, scrambling, and trying desperately to maintain composure in front of their peers. And yet, as satisfying as this was, it was only the beginning. My real plan required patience. It required time to let them believe they had defeated me. Every sneer they had given me, every dismissive glance, became a motivation. I realized that the streets had done more than teach me survival. They had taught me perspective. They had stripped away false humility and replaced it with sharp calculation. I could now operate in ways they would never anticipate because they never saw me as a threat. It was during this period of careful planning that I reconnected with someone from my past, an old friend who had always believed in me, though he had no idea of my current predicament. His name was Daniel, and he had a keen mind for finance and technology. We met quietly, a simple coffee meet in a corner cafe where no one would recognize me. I told him a half-truth, framing my situation as a challenge, a personal experiment to test human behavior and resilience. He was intrigued and agreed to help, offering subtle tools and advice that would allow me to manipulate outcomes without direct exposure. With Daniel's guidance, I began setting up scenarios where my parents' arrogance and ignorance would be revealed to their peers, to their associates, and most importantly, to themselves. I created situations where contracts went missing, documents were lost, and minor business embarrassments unfolded, all orchestrated in ways that made it seem accidental, unavoidable, but undeniably linked to poor oversight on their part. I watched from a distance, taking quiet satisfaction in their flustered faces and their futile attempts to regain control. Despite the thrill of strategic victory, there were moments of introspection. The streets had not only hardened me, but had shown me what I truly valued. Wealth, power, and revenge were intoxicating, yes, but they were meaningless without intelligence, patience, and self-control. I realized that true revenge wasn't about chaos or destruction. It was about revelation. It was about forcing them to see what they had overlooked, what they had underestimated, what they had lost, and then came the breakthrough. I discovered that my parents had been hiding a series of investments, minor holdings that they believed were untouchable. They thought I was naive, incapable of understanding or accessing them. But with Daniel's help, I quietly gained insight into these holdings, tracking patterns, learning connections, understanding leverage points. What they considered secret was, in fact, vulnerable, and I was ready to exploit it. I began to integrate my street observations with my financial strategy. Vendors, delivery people, and local workers who had once seemed trivial became pieces in a larger puzzle. Their habits, access, and trust could be subtly manipulated to create outcomes that would destabilize my parents' sense of control. Every small move was a step toward the bigger reveal, a reveal that would leave them not just embarrassed but speechless, forced to confront the reality of my true power. It was a delicate balance. I had to maintain my invisibility while creating disruption. I had to appear vulnerable, powerless, and lost, while quietly building influence, manipulating events, and gathering intelligence. Every day, I honed this skill, becoming increasingly confident in my ability to operate behind the scenes. And every night, as I curled up under blankets that had become my temporary fortress, I imagined the moment when I would finally step out from the shadows and confront them, not with anger, not with hatred, but with undeniable evidence of my resilience, intelligence, and wealth. The satisfaction was almost overwhelming. The thought of them realizing that the daughter they had cast out was not only alive but thriving beyond their comprehension made the bitter taste of betrayal almost sweet. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and in doing so, had unknowingly handed me the tools for a flawless revenge. And yet I reminded myself, patience was key. The streets had taught me that timing could be everything. Strike too soon, and the impact would be muted. Wait too long, and they might sense the threat. I had to let them believe they had triumphed, that I was gone, lost, powerless. Only then would my return, my revelation, be complete. As the third week ended, I felt a surge of anticipation. I had survived, adapted, and learned. I had planted the seeds of my revenge, tested my strategies, and discovered unexpected allies. And more importantly, I had discovered the most crucial element of all, control. They had thought they controlled me, controlled my life, controlled my destiny, but the truth was far more exhilarating. I controlled the narrative, the outcome, and soon I would control their realization of it. The streets had not broken me, they had sharpened me. They had transformed betrayal into power, weakness into strategy, and invisibility into influence. And as I prepared for the next stage of my plan, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the days of underestimation were over, and the days of revelation were about to begin. By the time December arrived, something had changed inside me. The cold no longer frightened me. The streets no longer felt hostile. They felt familiar, controlled, almost quiet. I had stopped counting days. Time was no longer something happening to me. Time was something I was using. From the outside, I still looked like a woman who had been thrown away by her family, someone invisible, someone forgotten. But inside, everything was moving carefully, precisely. My parents, meanwhile, were starting to feel uneasy. I could sense it even without seeing them. Their public smiles were still there, but cracks were forming. Small things kept going wrong: a missed meeting, a delayed payment, a partner suddenly pulling back without explanation. None of it was big enough to cause panic, but together it created tension, confusion. Doubt, and doubt was exactly what I wanted. They had always believed control was their strength. They believed money made them powerful, but what they never understood was this: control doesn't come from money alone. It comes from information, timing, silence. I had all three. One afternoon I passed by a store window and caught my reflection. For a moment I didn't recognize myself. My face looked thinner, my eyes sharper. There was a calm there that hadn't existed before. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt the way I had been that Thanksgiving morning. I was focused, and focus is far more dangerous than rage. That same day, I took the first real step that couldn't be undone. Through Daniel and a network of quiet professionals who never asked personal questions, I began moving serious assets, not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to shift weight, to create pressure where my parents were most comfortable. Their investments didn't collapse, they didn't explode, they simply stalled, and nothing scares powerful people more than a loss they can't explain. I imagined my father sitting at his desk late at night, staring at numbers that didn't add up. I imagined my mother pretending everything was fine while her voice tightened with every phone call. They wouldn't say it out loud yet, but they were beginning to feel it. The ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they thought. And still they had no idea I was anywhere nearby. I stayed invisible. I kept sleeping where no one would look twice. I kept my head down in public. I listened more than I spoke. People on the streets started recognizing me, not as weak, but as someone steady. Someone who understood the rules, that respect mattered. It reminded me that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply exists. Then something happened that almost broke my patience. I overheard a conversation outside a cafe. Two women were talking about my parents, about how strong they were, about how they had done the right thing by cutting off their ungrateful daughter. That daughter was me, For a moment my chest tightened. Old pain tried to rise again. The urge to step forward, to shout the truth, to expose everything right then and there, it was strong. But I didn't. I swallowed it. Because revenge rushed is revenge wasted. Instead, I smiled to myself, let them talk, let them believe the story my parents had written. It would make the ending so much more powerful. A few days later, I made my next move. This one wasn't financial. It was emotional. I sent my mother a message, not from my number, not from anything traceable, just a short, anonymous note. Not everything abandoned stays gone. That was it. Nothing more. I imagined her reading it. Frowning, showing it to my father, laughing it off at first, but later when they were alone, when the house was quiet, that sentence would echo, "Not everything abandoned stays gone." It was a warning. And a promise. Their behavior started changing after that. I could tell from the way people spoke about them. My mother grew more withdrawn, my father more aggressive, they argued more, they blamed others. They tightened control, which only made things worse. People don't respond well when desperation hides behind authority, and all the while I stayed silent. 3 weeks had passed since Thanksgiving. 3 weeks since I had been told to go live in the streets. 3 weeks since they believed I had hit rock bottom. What they didn't know was this. During those same 3 weeks, my net worth crossed $25 million. Quietly, cleanly, without celebration, money I didn't flash, power I didn't announce because the reveal was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic in the way movies are. It would be worse. It would be calm, controlled, undeniable, the kind of moment that makes people replay every decision they've ever made. As I walked through the city that night, lights glowing around me, I realized something important. My parents had given me a gift without knowing it. They had stripped away my need for approval. They had pushed me into becoming someone they could no longer control. They thought the streets would humble me. Instead, they sharpened me, and soon, very soon, they would be forced to face the daughter they thought they had erased, not as a beggar, not as a failure, but as the consequence of their own cruelty. By the 4th week, I had learned to move in shadows, to appear powerless while quietly steering events. The streets had taught me patience. They had taught me that the smallest actions, when calculated carefully, could ripple far beyond what anyone imagined. And now I was ready to expand my influence. My parents' arrogance had grown to almost comic proportions in the weeks following Thanksgiving. They assumed I was suffering silently, that I had been humbled, that the world had proven me powerless. But they were wrong. Every decision they made, every small victory they believed they had achieved, was part of a pattern I had already noticed, catalogued, and planned around. The first direct confrontation with reality came quietly, without fanfare. A business associate of my father's, someone who had trusted him blindly for years, began asking questions that didn't make sense to him. "I don't understand these discrepancies," the man had said over the phone. "It's like numbers are moving on their own." My father, confident as ever, brushed it off. "It must be an accounting error. Don't worry, I'll fix it." But I knew better. I had orchestrated those errors weeks before, shifting minor assets and sending anonymous tips. Small changes invisible if you weren't paying attention, yet enough to unsettle someone like my father, and unsettle him they did. Meanwhile, my mother's social circle was starting to notice subtle cracks. Invitations to events were delayed, donations were misdirected, and a few long-standing friends suddenly acted distant. At first, she blamed coincidence. Then she blamed external circumstances. But slowly, she began to sense an invisible hand at work, something she couldn't control, something she couldn't predict. I stayed in the background, observing every reaction, savoring every subtle panic, every sleepless night. I didn't need to confront them directly. The fear of the unknown, the growing awareness that things were slipping beyond their control, was far more effective. And then, the anonymous message. I sent another note to my mother, this time slightly more pointed. "Everything you think you control is only temporary." I imagined her reading it, imagined the chill that would creep up her spine, the doubt that would gnaw at her mind. I didn't need her to know it was me. At least, not yet. All I needed was for her to feel the weight of uncertainty, the creeping awareness that the daughter they had thrown away was still very much present. The streets had taught me how to move unnoticed, how to gather intelligence, and how to exploit weaknesses without revealing myself. And now I was using those skills to the fullest. Every small interaction, every person I had met during my exile, was a tool. Everyone I had learned from, observed, or befriended was a stepping stone toward the moment when my parents would be forced to recognize me, not as a powerless girl, but as a woman who had everything they thought they had taken away. By the 5th week, the tension had grown unbearable. My father's calls were sharper, my mother's sighs heavier. They were grasping at control, trying desperately to make sense of events they didn't understand. And all the while I stayed in the shadows, smiling quietly to myself. One evening, as I walked past a high-end boutique near the city's financial district, I realized something crucial. I didn't need to rush the final reveal. The anticipation itself was a weapon. The days of uncertainty, the tiny anxieties, the creeping sense that something was amiss, those were far more painful than any direct confrontation. But the time for subtlety was approaching its limit. I had gathered enough leverage, amassed enough resources, and orchestrated enough small disruptions to move to the next stage. The moment when my parents would see the truth, my true power, my resilience, my fortune, was close. Closer than they could possibly imagine. I remembered Thanksgiving morning vividly, the shock in my chest, the betrayal, the disbelief. That memory fueled me now, transformed into a quiet, relentless determination. They had believed they could humiliate me, they had believed they could erase me, but they had only created the conditions for their own undoing, and then the opportunity presented itself. It was a gala my parents had organized, a showcase of their social and financial influence. Normally, I would have ignored it entirely, but this was too perfect to pass up. It was a concentrated gathering of everyone who had witnessed their triumph over me, their friends, colleagues, social circles, all complicit in thinking I had failed. I would attend, but not as Isabella the abandoned daughter, not as someone recognizable. I would attend as an unknown entity with the power to dismantle their carefully curated world, piece by piece, with subtlety and precision. The plan began taking shape in my mind. Small financial accidents, carefully timed embarrassments, a few well-placed truths whispered in the right ears, and the rest would unfold naturally. They would see it all too late, realize too late, and face a reckoning they had never imagined. I walked through the city that night, lights flickering off the wet pavement, feeling a surge of exhilaration. The streets had not defeated me, they had strengthened me. The betrayal I had felt that Thanksgiving morning had been transformed into strategy. Anger had become patience, hurt had become calculation, and now the moment of reckoning was approaching. I whispered to myself, quiet as the wind, soon they will know exactly who I am. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in elegance and illusion. Crystal lights shimmered above polished floors. Laughter echoed through a room filled with people who believed they were untouchable. My parents stood at the center of it all, smiling proudly, shaking hands, playing their roles perfectly. From the outside they looked powerful, successful, respected, but I knew better. I arrived quietly, no grand entrance, no dramatic reveal. Just another guest among many, dressed simply but flawlessly. My hair was styled differently, my posture was different. Even if my parents had looked directly at me, they wouldn't have recognized the woman I had become, and that was the point. As I moved through the room, I listened. People talked freely when they thought no one important was listening. They complained about delayed payments, about confusing emails, about projects that suddenly felt unstable. Each conversation confirmed what I already knew. The pressure was working. I didn't rush, I didn't interfere directly. I simply placed myself where I needed to be at the right moments, letting small truths slip into the right ears. Oh, that account, I'd say casually. I heard it's under review. That partnership, I'd whisper lightly. I was told it might be restructuring, and nothing accusatory, nothing obvious, just enough uncertainty to make people question what they thought they knew. I watched my father closely. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. He laughed too loudly, he checked his phone too often. Control was slipping, and he could feel it. My mother was worse. She scanned the room constantly, her shoulders tight, her confidence brittle. She sensed judgment. She sensed whispers, and she hated it, At one point she brushed past me, so close I could smell her perfume. For a brief second our eyes met, her gaze lingered, confused, curious. Something about me unsettled her. She didn't recognize her daughter. That moment alone was worth everything. Later in the evening the first real crack appeared. One of my father's longest standing partners confronted him, quietly but firmly. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the reaction. My father's face drained of color. His posture stiffened. He nodded too quickly, promised things he couldn't guarantee. The illusion was collapsing in real time. And still I stayed calm. I slipped away to the balcony, breathing in the cold night air. For a moment memories rushed back. Thanksgiving morning, the door closing behind me, the words "go live in the streets." I had walked away with nothing but pride and silence. Now I stood above them all, not because I was richer, not because I was smarter, but because I had endured what they never could. When I returned inside, the energy had shifted. Conversations were shorter. Laughter was forced. People were leaving early. My parents' perfect evening was unraveling, thread by thread, and they couldn't stop it. As I made my way toward the exit, I passed a table where my mother stood alone, gripping her glass too tightly. I paused beside her just for a second. "You know," I said softly, "sometimes the people we push away come back stronger than we expect." She turned sharply. "Excuse me," but I was already walking away. That single sentence haunted her. I knew it would, because deep down she felt it. She felt the truth pressing against the walls she had built. I left the gala unnoticed. No applause, no confrontation. No drama, but behind me the damage was done. That night my parents didn't sleep. I knew because the next morning everything escalated. Calls went unanswered, meetings were canceled, rumors spread faster than facts. The social circle they depended on began distancing itself. Respect was turning into suspicion, and still, they had no idea it was me. I returned to the streets one last time, sitting on the same bench where I had spent my first night after Thanksgiving. I looked around and felt gratitude instead of pain. This place had stripped me down and rebuilt me stronger. 3 weeks on the streets had done what years of comfort never could. It had taught me who I was. And now the final stage was coming, the stage where the truth would no longer hide in shadows, the stage where my parents would finally learn what they had done, and who they had done it to, not with anger, not with shouting, but with undeniable reality. The morning after the gala, I sat in a small cafe, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold, watching the city wake. My plan was unfolding perfectly. My parents were rattled, their perfect world cracking silently, but still they didn't know why. That was the beauty of patience. Fear grows faster than understanding. By now, I had carefully orchestrated evidence, documents lost, only to reappear in ways that exposed mistakes, emails redirected, contracts subtly altered. Nothing violent, nothing illegal, just perfectly timed reveals that made my parents look incompetent. The first major revelation came through a letter delivered anonymously. My father opened it in his study, expecting yet another mundane invoice. Instead, he found a detailed account of mismanaged investments, partnerships at risk, and missed opportunities. Every item had been real. Every mistake had been orchestrated. He read, reread, and reread again, disbelief spreading across his face like wildfire. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. My mother's awakening was subtler, but far more damaging. She received a whispered tip from a trusted friend, a simple, casual remark about an account she had assumed was secure. But it was gone, or at least inaccessible, and the realization hit her like a wave. Every social maneuver, every charitable appearance, every carefully crafted image she had relied on suddenly felt hollow. And I stayed in the shadows, observing, waiting, letting them feel the slow burn of revelation. By mid-afternoon, the first confrontation began, not from me, not yet, but from the people they had trusted. Partners, friends, colleagues, all questioning, doubting, demanding answers. My parents scrambled to regain control, their usual confidence faltering. I watched from a distance, invisible, almost serene. I had learned long ago that revenge is far sweeter when it doesn't scream for attention. Let them come to you, let them feel the consequences of underestimating you. Then came the first sign that my plan was working even deeper than I had hoped. My mother, frantic and desperate, called a close family friend, seeking advice, and in her voice, I could hear it even through the distance, the tremor of fear. She had begun to sense the truth, though she couldn't yet name it. By evening, I decided it was time for a subtle personal touch. A small, untraceable gift arrived at their home, a leather-bound notebook, one I had used during my weeks on the streets. Inside, a single message in handwriting they recognized immediately. 3 weeks changed everything. You thought I was gone. You were wrong. My mother's hands trembled as she read it. My father's face went pale. For the first time, they understood that their daughter, me, had never been powerless. They searched. They asked questions. They tried to piece it together, but the truth was designed to evade them. Every clue was carefully placed, but never revealing too much. It was like watching someone try to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are invisible, and in that moment I realized how complete their unawareness had been. They had truly believed that abandoning me had destroyed me. They had assumed weakness, ignorance, powerlessness, but all of that had been a lie, one I had lived to expose. Over the next few days, their world began to unravel further. Investments that had been thought secure were suddenly scrutinized. Social invitations dwindled. Minor business mishaps amplified into noticeable problems. Every day, my presence was felt, though my face remained unseen. And the final revelation, the climax of my patience, was approaching. I prepared for it meticulously. Every detail had to be perfect, every word carefully chosen, every moment calculated for maximum impact. When the time came, it wouldn't just be a confrontation. It would be undeniable proof. A clear, unarguable revelation of who I was, what I had accomplished, and how wrong they had been. They had thought they had won, but the daughter they had abandoned was already the storm. It was a quiet evening when I finally decided the time had come. I didn't need a grand stage, a shouting match, or dramatic theatrics. All I needed was precision, presence, and undeniable proof. The streets had taught me how to move quietly, but strike with impact. Tonight they would feel the full force of that lesson. I walked into their home, dressed simply, carrying nothing that suggested wealth. They were in the living room, my mother adjusting a vase that had always been slightly crooked. My father staring at a financial statement he couldn't quite comprehend. Both of them frozen in their routines, unaware that the narrative of their lives was about to shift. "Isabella," my mother said, eyes widening. "What? How did you?" I held up a hand, calm, controlled. "Don't worry, Mother. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to show you." I reached into my bag and pulled out a tablet. I tapped a few keys, and instantly the room filled with visuals of my accomplishments, detailed financial reports, investment statements, property acquisitions, and business ventures, all in my name. $25 million, carefully amassed in 3 weeks, managed with skill, patience, and intelligence. My father's jaw went slack. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Silence, shock, disbelief. "You sent me to live in the streets," I said, my voice steady, each word deliberate. "You thought you could break me. You thought I would fail. You thought abandoning me would make me powerless." I paused, letting it sink in. Let them feel the weight of every dismissive word, every cruel instruction, every moment they thought they had won. "And yet," I continued, "here I am, not broken, not lost, not defeated." My mother tried to speak, but no words came. My father's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a trick, a loophole, some explanation that would make this illusion disappear. "There is no trick," I said softly. "No magic, no one else, just patience, strategy, and resilience, and 3 weeks, 3 weeks that changed everything you thought you knew about me." The tablet displayed one final slide, a letter addressed to both of them. Carefully written, detailing the lessons they had inadvertently taught me through cruelty and neglect. Not angry, not hateful, just the truth. "You underestimated me." The letter read, "You abandoned me, and in doing so, you created the conditions for your own reckoning. The streets didn't destroy me, they taught me, they sharpened me, and now you must face the daughter you believed you had erased." My parents were speechless. Words failed them. Their pride, their carefully constructed sense of control, crumbled before their eyes. I didn't shout. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't need to. The power in the room shifted naturally. The truth hung between us, undeniable, complete, and impossible to ignore. For a long moment, they simply stared, trying to process the woman before them. the daughter they had dismissed, underestimated, and abandoned. And slowly realization sank in, every slight, every cruel word, every moment they had thought they had the upper hand, exposed, undone. I took a deep breath. I'm not here to destroy you, I said. I'm here to remind you that actions have consequences. You thought this was a test of obedience. It was a lesson in resilience, and you've just learned it the hardest way. The silence stretched, heavy, dense, full of unspoken admissions, regrets, and newfound respect. Then quietly my mother whispered, we didn't know. I know, I said softly, and that's why I waited, because the truth is more powerful than anger, more enduring than resentment, and finally, unavoidable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure, not victory over them, but clarity. The betrayal I had endured had been transformed, not into hatred, but into awareness, power, confidence, and the ultimate lesson: no one has the right to define your worth but you. They could never undo what I had accomplished. They could never take back the lessons I had learned, the strength I had built, or the life I had reclaimed. And tonight they understood, completely, painfully, that the daughter they had abandoned was not only alive, but unstoppable. And in that moment I realized something profound. Revenge is not about destruction. It's about revelation. It's about showing the truth so clearly that it cannot be ignored. And that truth, finally, was theirs to face. The days after the reveal were quiet. My parents no longer tried to dominate me. They didn't argue, didn't blame, didn't pretend everything was fine. They simply stared, processing the consequences of their own choices. And I let them. I didn't gloat. I didn't demand apologies. That wasn't the point. Revenge had never been about humiliation. It had been about clarity, about truth, about showing them without question the consequences of underestimating someone they had dismissed as weak. The streets, once a place of hardship, had become a teacher. They had stripped me of false comforts and false perceptions. They had forced me to adapt, to observe, to strategize, and to understand the value of patience, resilience, and control. And now, standing above the rubble of their assumptions, I felt free. My parents eventually began to speak again, haltingly at first. We were wrong. My mother admitted one morning, her voice small and hesitant. My father nodded silently, still processing the reality. I forgave them, not out of kindness, but because revenge is most effective when it teaches without lingering bitterness. Holding on to anger would have only tethered me to the past. Letting it go allowed me to step fully into the life I had created, one built on strength, independence, and unshakable self-worth. The money, the success, the intricate planning, those were only symbols of what I had gained. The real reward was knowledge, the knowledge that no one has the right to define your limits. No one has the right to discard you, underestimate you, or diminish your worth. That power always resides within you. Weeks later, my parents began to make quiet efforts to rebuild trust. Not that I needed them to. The lesson had been delivered, and it was irreversible. They had been forced to confront the reality. Their daughter, whom they had cast out, was no longer the same girl they had tried to control. She was stronger, smarter, resilient beyond measure. I walked through the city one afternoon, the wind brushing against my face, and I realized something important. Life will sometimes betray you. People will sometimes betray you. But the betrayal of others does not define you. How you respond does, and my response had transformed me into someone unrecognizable to them, but entirely true to myself. In the end, revenge isn't about hurting those who wronged you. It's about reclaiming your power, asserting your truth, and showing the world that underestimation can be fatal to the ignorant. Those who betray often believe they've won. But if you wait, observe, and act with patience, they will inevitably face the consequences of their own actions. And that truth, calm, precise, undeniable, is more satisfying than any act of fury. As I sat on a park bench that evening, watching the city lights twinkle, I felt gratitude for the journey. For the pain, the betrayal, the streets that had shaped me, and the parents who had inadvertently taught me my greatest lesson. Never let anyone decide your worth. Never let anyone dismiss your potential, and never, ever underestimate yourself. I smiled quietly, knowing one thing with certainty: the daughter they had tried to break was not just back. She was unstoppable, and this time they knew it. Weeks turned into months and the dust settled. My parents, once proud and unshakable, had been forced to reconsider everything about themselves, their choices, and the daughter they had discarded. They never fully regained the same sense of control they once wielded, and I never intended for them to. The lesson had been learned, and it was permanent. As for me, life had taken on a new rhythm. I no longer measured myself against the expectations of others, nor did I seek validation from anyone who had once dismissed me. The streets that had been my crucible remained a quiet part of my story, a reminder of how far I had come. They had taught me patience, cunning, and strength, lessons no classroom or luxury could ever provide. I continued to grow my wealth, carefully, strategically, without arrogance or unnecessary display. $25 million was not just a number. It was a symbol of resilience, of transformation, of the power of quietly reclaiming what was always yours to begin with. But more importantly, it was a tool, a reminder that nothing in life comes without effort, and that the most meaningful victories are earned, not handed out. Occasionally, I would hear whispers from people in my parents' circle, conversations that hinted they were still trying to understand how I had accomplished what I had in such a short time. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The truth had already been revealed, and it was irreversible. The daughter they thought they had crushed had risen, unshakable and fully in control of her destiny, and me, I thrived in the freedom of my own life. I invested in businesses that mattered, connected with people who respected me for who I was, and occasionally revisited the streets, not out of necessity, but as a meditation, a reminder of how every challenge I had faced had forged the person I had become. Sometimes I would think back to that Thanksgiving morning. The words they spoke, the cruelty they intended, the disbelief they had assumed would paralyze me, and I would smile quietly, because every insult, every act of abandonment, every moment of doubt they placed upon me had been fuel. Fuel for patience, fuel for strategy, fuel for a transformation that they could neither stop nor predict. In the end, revenge is not about destruction. It is about revelation, about showing people, not in anger but in undeniable truth, the consequences of their actions. About proving that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, observes, and arrives quietly, devastatingly, and completely. I had learned that lesson. My parents had learned that lesson. And now I moved forward, carrying no bitterness, only clarity and purpose. The girl they tried to erase no longer existed. She had been replaced by a woman who understood her own worth, controlled her own power, and would never again allow anyone to define her limits. Life is unpredictable. People will betray you, circumstances will challenge you, but the most important lesson, the one I had learned through pain, strategy, and resilience, is that your power, your worth, and your destiny are yours alone to claim. And once you claim them, no one can ever take them away. I stood once more on the streets that had tested me, looked at the city around me, and whispered softly to myself, I am here, I am unstoppable, and this time everyone knows it. The past was behind me. The lessons were clear, and the future, mine, was endless.